In this interview, I speak to Davey, a researcher at the University of Otago, New Zealand. I contacted him after reading about his plans to search for differences in people's ability to regulate their emotions, depending on whether they were trained to focus on the gut area versus the heart area or upper chest area. I was intrigued to find out that Stephen's background is in Buddhist body awareness practices, and this led him to conduct his research. He has an interest in suicide prevention and how developing interceptive skills may help. He's really testing the idea that internal body awareness may differ from person to person as a result of a survival mechanism that places a survival payoff or advantage on staying focused on the outside world compared to the inside world. More specifically, if a person grows up in a stressful environment that leads to them focusing on the outside world too much, then they may only become aware of their internal feelings that form part of their emotions at a later stage when things have got so out of control that it's too late to self-regulate. I really hope you enjoy this interview. When I read your pilot study paper, it was kind of music to my ears, really, in terms of how you described and your sort of hypotheses and how you describe the idea that we can spend a certain amount of time externally focused versus internally focused, and the whole idea of the inhibition of our internal sensations. So it made so much sense to me from a therapy point of view, and I've not really come across anyone else doing a study to kind of get some more granularity and more clarity on it in a really rigorous research way. So yeah, that's why I sort of dropped you an email, and hopefully this recording, if you're happy for it to be shown to the intern as part of her induction. And then also we're hoping to share it I'm hoping to share some of these conversations more broadly with therapists online to give them sort of some, really, I think there needs to be some bridging of the research with what people are actually putting into practice day to day. So, because there seems to be so much, so many people doing great work, but not necessarily understanding which bits of it are effective and which bits of it are maybe unnecessary or maybe even not helpful.
There's a lot to talk about, lots of different aspects of the study that I'm doing. I mean, I agree with you. When I'm doing database searches to look for, or just to really sort of get up to date with, has anybody published on this specific area, keep seeing my own publications coming up, which in some ways is not all that heartening, because you just think, well, at some point this work has to get traction, because it seems to be the direction that things are heading in. And there's a huge kind of groundswell of interest in interoception, and specifically visceroception, which is the sense of the viscera, which is the part of the body which seems to be related to emotional experience, emotional intensity, and emotion regulation. And so, yeah, I mean, things are happening, but you kind of get the sense to some extent that some of these therapies are happening regardless of what the reality is, like it's sort of jumping the gun. And you see that a lot in things like probiotics as well. You see a kind of jumping the gun there. Like I think the jury is currently out about, what role the gut has in mental health. But it doesn't stop people from selling probiotics or talking about them as being psychobiotics as a kind of intervention. So I mean, I as much as I'm committed to interoception research, and I have my own thoughts about that and my own experiences of it, I want in sort of good faith to do the kind of research that actually grounds it in the kind of tradition of research that I'm familiar with, So yeah, we can talk about that and how these kind of different experiences have come together for me. Yeah,
great. That would be great, because I sort of on the university website. Is it Otago? Is that how you pronounce it?
Otago, yeah.
Otago. So I saw your kind of brief resume on there. So you've got a really interesting background in psychology and analytical philosophy. So, and I'm interested to see you've worked here in the UK, in London as well, for the UK government, and also in China. So how did those different aspects of your career lead you to this current study?
Yeah. Well, I am actually British, and so I lived for most of my life in the UK until I met a New Zealander, and we moved to China for her work, and then I just did some work out there. sort of vaguely psychologically related, and then we moved to New Zealand, where she's from, and so I am like you, and my background is in philosophy initially, but in some ways that's a bit of a red herring when it comes to interoception. I mean, I guess the only connection is that training just gives me a kind of a willingness to question some of the assumptions that people tend to make. You know, like I'm willing to take that sort of bird's eye view of a whole area of research, and in fact, part of the thesis I've just finished, one early chapter was using sort of my philosophical background, so specifically the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, to look at some of the ways in which we use language around emotion to sort of look at what kind of assumptions are embedded in those concepts that might prevent us from actually taking seriously the idea that emotion could be localized, which is really what the whole study is about and is for. Is about looking at this kind of very different way of thinking about emotion, and how a kind of an engagement with that phenomenon could lead into sort of practical sort of benefits for people. But actually the sort of the source of it was actually my experience of Zen Buddhism, which I was practicing in the UK with somebody called Dr. Clive Sherlock, who himself, so he trained with a teacher in London, and so did I, but then I trained through him primarily. He's developed his own kind of therapy, I guess, a kind of secularized form of Zen Buddhism. So you may want to talk to him as well in terms of, you know, some of the stuff that you're looking at. He's been practicing, he's been delivering that therapy for, I guess, about 40 years now, maybe longer. And and that's very much sort of like based on this embodied experience of emotion. And so it was through practicing Buddhism that actually I kind of got some experiences that I think in many ways research should be grounded in it can be grounded in one's experience, and you're looking to see, well, actually, is this just my own subjectivity that I'm looking at here, or is there actually something beneath that? And so the localization part was that through that training, people in those groups, they tend to sort of report the same kind of experiences in terms of emotion. Like eventually you kind of get to a point where you are having localized experiences, you know, and this is quite far into the training, I would say. It probably took me 10 years or so to even get a sense that was happening. And so I think, you know, then start thinking about how I might develop hypotheses to actually test, is this a reality? And so that was really, it was really at that point. And then I came across interoception just from searching through databases. When I was in China, I started to develop thoughts around how I might develop a study. I was thinking about doing a PhD. Had never heard of interoception, and I think it was Hugo Critchley was there, I think, and also Oliver Cameron as well. He wrote a paper that was a kind of synthesis of lots of different areas of research that related to interoception, including the work of Georgi Adam. I don't know if you've come across him, a Hungarian physiologist. So then I read his book Visceral Reception, and it sort of went from there, really. And so yeah, that's really the roots of it all. So yeah,
fascinating. So before we, you know, I was attracted to the pilot study paper. Before we dive into that, just a little bit more then about your experience. So you practiced Buddhism for a while, maybe you still do, and what I'm guessing, what I'm hearing is part of that meditation practice involved turning your attention inwards, and then you started to experience some ability to determine subtle differences in different internal organs or tissues. So rather than just these, on your paper you talked about extreme kind of when your body's screaming at you and you notice, obviously most people experience something in their body, the heart racing or pain, but is it the subtlety of these quieter sensations that you're talking about here?
Well, I mean, the purpose of meditation is to really slow processing down, and so you do start to notice, it sort of gets the noise levels down in terms of your interoceptive perceptions. I mean, it reverses the arrow of attention to inside rather than outside, or exteroceptively, as I've used in the kind of the Western paradigm. And it's specifically in relation to an emotional response. So yeah, you do start to notice sort of subtle differences and changes in your body, but it's the kind of the foundation of the Buddhist practice is really working with emotion. You know, it's that's really the foundation of that transformation of, we don't really know what emotions are, but whatever they are, that's what we're working with, and they change over time, and your relationship with them changes over time. And part of that is starting to sense them at an earlier stage of an emotional response. And you know, this is in some ways, it's no surprise that it's not something that's a common experience, because, you know, typically when there's an emotional stimulus in the environment, your attention is drawn to that stimulus. It's not drawn to inside your own body. So it's not it wouldn't seem to be a natural response to be able to sense what's happening in your body at that moment, which is, you know, a split second. And but that's what the process of undertaking the meditative process of Zen, or Buddhism generally, leads you to, where when the emotion response occurs, you're in with your body at that point. And so it's almost like, and this gets into the emotion regulation aspect of the study, you know, that the idea of being able to regulate emotion so that you've got this kind of sweet spot where you've got enough of an interaction and engagement with an emotional response to be able to use that, but not so much that you're kind of jittery all the time, you know, you're overreactive. That ability to be with the emotional response when it occurs means that you have an ability to then prevent that emotion from spilling out into thoughts, into action, and into the kind of vicious cycles that you tend to see in people who are detached from their own bodies and detached from their own emotional responses, and maybe aren't able to sort of process them in the way that many people would. I would say that many people actually struggle with that to some degree. To some degree, there are some who they struggle to a great extent. So typically people with alexithymia, for instance, who don't have that ability to engage. And so it's almost like the processes of emotion, they occur in spite of them, alongside their own experiences, and they're not really able to do this regulation process. So so that's what the meditation process sort of leads you to. And it just struck me that the localization of emotion, that experience of having this, how can I say, like a sensation in a single part of your body, was almost kind of pain-like. There was a pain-like quality to that, in the sense that pain is typically a localized experience. And whereas you talk about emotion and say, you know, the title of my thesis is "Where is an Emotion," which is a nod to William James. What is an emotion? That question doesn't really make sense. It doesn't make sense in a kind of Western way of looking at emotion, and hence that's why the philosophy was important, to look at, well, why is it the case that we don't make sense of a question like that about where is emotion? And
broadly in culture, I don't think that does make sense. In the kind of therapy world, though, there are lots of schools which have kind of attempted to match different emotions to the different body parts. I guess you've heard of the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, Professor
much
Barrett. So her work was popularized with how emotions are made. So she would argue that it was that the emotions themselves are just concepts or categories of experiences, and that emotions don't exist in the body so much. It's more these different states we can enter, and that's they're features of, let's say, the autonomic nervous system or hormonal changes. So how does your view fit with that view then? Are you saying that different sets of physiological states will localize and we then label those as emotions? Or
I mean, very similar. I mean, I drew very heavily on Lisa Feldman Barrett's work in my thesis, and really sort of use that as the sort of the counter to what is still the dominant view, which is the basic emotion view of people like Paul Ekman, typically Paul Ekman, where you've got this categorization of emotion. And I mean, Lisa Feldman Barrett is a neuroscientist, a neuropsychologist. I'm not, so I took a very different kind of approach to that. So I mean, I looked at it as a constructive process, but within a Wittgensteinian frame. So it's really looking at, why do we have categorization of emotion?
Okay.
Paul Ekman would say that's because they are in the brain. You know, there's a part of the brain that lights up when you're angry versus when you're feeling joyful. they have biological value. That's why they've been selected for in that way. That's why the brain is partitioned off in this kind of natural kind, set of natural kinds that correspond to the terms that we use when we talk about emotion. But again, thinking back to my original experiences of emotion in Buddhist practice, there's an explicit prescription to not label your experiences, to not engage with the conceptualization of those experiences, and that's part and parcel of what leads to that localized experience. So it's almost like, you know, you have all these kind of concepts that sort of hover above, and then you've got a kind of core dimension of that, which is an embodied experience that appears, and this is where the subjectivity part, does it meet the sort of objective standards of academic psychology?
Yeah.
Things like that informs each of those conceptualizations. Each of those concepts, they correspond to a domain of use, which is where the Wittgenstein stuff, I don't know if you're familiar with sort of Wittgenstein stuff, but so he would talk about meaning as use. So meaning is a kind of tool, you know, and that's where meaning comes from. It's just, and it's very it's deceptively very simple kind of approach to a lot of issues within philosophy, is Wittgenstein's work. But in some ways it's just eloquent in terms of its ability to dissolve problems. So the notion that anger can be used in a certain way in a set of circumstances makes sense. I mean, there is definitely a role for those concepts for certain kinds of thoughts and behaviors, and the same with joy and sadness. They all, I mean, you can articulate in general what's underlying each of those categories. And so hence the idea of asking the question of where an emotion is, it doesn't make sense, precisely because the language is not used for the purposes that correspond to the notion of where an emotion might be. It's more, well, an emotion is nowhere. It's actually, has a functional role with the external environment when we're talking about the categorizations. But if we're talking about what might be underlying all those categorizations, then we can start talking about localization.
Right.
So in terms of what Feldman Barrett is saying, to my mind, is that she's talking about in each instance where you get a physical response to the environment, there's also a top-down constructive process that happens in each instance. We then group together those kinds of experiences and we label them anger, joy, so on. So that's the point of correspondence, really, is that what is the grouping principle for all those different experiences? So, well, that would seem to be that they have a domain where these things are united in terms of the kinds of goals that people are wanting in those situations, the kind of things that make sense in those situations for, say, anger to occur. And then you can start to see boundaries between those kind of instances. So it wouldn't make sense to be angry when we get what we want, for instance. I mean, typically that kind of thing. Anger has a role in specifically those kind of situations where your desires are thwarted, for instance. You know, so you can start to see how you might partition them off in that way. So I would say that's probably where the connections between what I'm doing and what Lisa Feldman Barrett is doing probably ends, because I think she's looking to see, or she's found, in fact, that the locations in brains when, say, anger is operative isn't necessarily the same place that somebody else might have lighting up in their brain when they're angry. And you might have a situation where somebody is not in an emotional state, but they still have that location lighting up. So you've got this double dissociation between locations and the labels that you apply, which is totally against the basic emotion view.
But it kind of makes sense from how we experience people day-to-day point of view, isn't it? Because everybody has a different way of communicating how they feel. So some person, you know, someone, if someone's let's say I'm worried about my child who's just fallen over, I might get into this habit of shouting at my child so that they don't do that dangerous thing again. So then, you know, it's easy for a child to confuse something like a parent's concern with anger, if that makes sense. So I guess I can see how the language and the reactions, they can all get very blurred when we're trying to build language and communicate around these things. But from a evolutionary point of view, I guess, with the wanting to the body is basically trying to survive and reproduce, and move away from threats and maintain some form of safety. So the feelings that propel our actions you'd think would be pretty consistent, even if the language used is different.
Yeah. I mean, consistent in terms of, and this is back to the Feldman Barrett and James Russell and so on. This kind of core affect, these two dimensions of intensity and valence that. Something that they talked about, that there's this kind of core affective space. So you have a sort of a quadrant, and you have at what point on the x and the y axis is the intensity and versus the valence and what have you. So in each instance, you do have maybe some consistency in terms of how those two interrelate. But the rest of the work is done, of course, by the conceptualization. So yeah, and like just to refer back to what you were saying before. I mean, you can have mixed emotion states for sure. But then it's like there are lots of complex parts of every environment. But it's not to say that you couldn't say, well, in some instances you'll have this stream of events happening only. And then over time, you can start to see how that differentiates, and it can be independent, but sometimes it's not independent, and it seems to be bound up with another state that also could be independent in a set of circumstances. So you can be angry at your child and also worried for them, And
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And that's where processes or practices like meditation and mindfulness help to untangle some of those multi-dimensional emotions, I suppose. If maybe we could move on to your study. So what stage is it at now? Are you have you begun or
finished?
Oh, you finished it. Okay. Oh wow, exciting.
Yeah.
From what I understand, you were looking at two broad areas of the body, one above the diaphragm, so the upper chest area, the heart area, and then below around the gut, and trying to see if the difference in results are after an 8-week period of people focusing in those two different areas. Did that lead to any changes in emotion regulation? Is that correct? That was
that's correct. That's broadly part of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So how did it go?
Well, it's so I'll just say that at the point now I've submitted the thesis, but the thesis is also what's called a hybrid thesis in Otago, where you publish, you submit you submit your thesis with certain chapters also being submitted journal articles. So so I've had three chapters already published, and there's another 4, well actually 5 coming through now. So in different stages of the review process. So we have done everything. I say me with the supervisors. And so I mentioned earlier about the pain part of this. I have to sort of refer back to that a bit. So the main outcome measures were sort of lab-based reaction time measures that I'm sure you'd have seen from the study protocol. And I mean, what I was thinking was, if this is like pain, because then you should expect to see faster reaction times, which is consistent with a previous study that used a kind of embodied approach regarding pain and cued locations. So they cued parts of the body, and then they applied a pain stimulus to a certain part of the body, and then they found that reaction times were faster when the part of the body was cued, as opposed to when it wasn't accurately cued. So it's okay, that makes sense. That's what happens when you feel pain. If you're focusing on your hand and someone puts a sort of I've got a pin here, puts a pin in your hand, you're more likely to react more quickly if you've already been cued. So your attention is already in your hand, right? So then I didn't know where emotion was, as opposed to knowing where the pain was going to be applied in this previous study by other authors. And so I was doing it by inference. So it's like, well, okay, I'm going to cue different parts of this person's body sitting in this lab. Yeah. And if they have faster reactions, then that could be an indication that that's where the emotional response is happening, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what I hypothesized, that there's going to be faster reactions. What I actually found was the complete opposite. The one group, I didn't hypothesize the lower abdominal group, which is kind of what I was thinking it might happen, that group is the group that would show faster reaction times, which is consistent with some of the literature, for instance, on the gut biome, and the vagus nerve and what have you, and the relationship that the gut has with emotional responses. But that group was actually significantly slower than both of the other groups in terms of their reactions. That surprised me. And of course, this is what pilot studies are for, is to sort of search through and investigate sort of some of the fundamentals. And often you are surprised by that result. So they had slower reaction times on 2 separate tasks, one of which was a stop signal task, where people have to withhold a response when they hear a tone. So it's kind of like it's like a measure of response inhibition. Okay. And then this other one that was a spatial cueing paradigm.
So those two, the stop cue and what was the other one? The spatial recognition.
Spatial cueing task and the stop signal task.
So they are they instructed to try and react as quickly as possible, or are they just not given any? Yeah, they are. Okay.
Yeah. So the speeded tasks, but the stop signal on some trials, they would hear a tone in their headphones, and then they had to withhold a response. So it was a measure of how good they are at stopping a response.
Okay. So, and what are they trying to stop in that situation then? What is the response they're trying to stop?
So they have to click a button so they see like a thing on the screen, whether it's basically a decision task that they have to do, and they have to do that as quickly as possible. And that's on the go trials. So they have go trials where they have to just keep going as quick as possible. So like an @ symbol appears on the screen, and then they've got to press some button to say, okay, that's happened. They might see a hash symbol otherwise, and they have to press the hash button as quickly as possible. But then as they're about to press the button, a tone would, on some trials, appear in their headphones, and then they had to stop pressing anything. So this paradigm, it allows you to measure the time it takes to stop your response.
What would normally that test be used to measure or to gain some insight into?
I guess all sorts of different conditions. I mean, if you're talking about somebody with a brain injury, for instance, that might have their inhibitory processes may have been disrupted. Somebody with ADHD, for instance, or OCD, possibly these kinds of measures of their ability to withhold responses. So if people are impulsive, for instance, they might have difficulties withholding responses.
Right. Okay.
So yeah.
So you found with that, for that test, people who had focused on their gut area for 8 weeks were slower to respond to both the tests, or just the inhibition?
So both the spatial cueing and the stop signal, so both tasks. So I mean, I'd anticipated that they would be slower on the stop signal task. So the idea would be that, let's say that emotion really was in the lower abdomen, for instance, and over time people became more aware of that, and then they were presented with an emotional stimulus in these tasks, and then they had to carry out the task immediately afterwards. Their attention would be directed at the emotion, and so there'd be more emotional response, a bit like there would be if there was pain. It'd be very distracting to have that kind of experience, and so that would impact on their reaction times. But the spatial cueing paradigm was very much, they would be faster simply because they're being cued to a specific location where there is this activity, and so that should facilitate a response to say, I'm experiencing something in my body right now, and I'm registering that. But as I say, that wasn't what I found, which kind of suggests a more generic phenomenon. So we're still, I mean, at the end of these papers that we're submitting now, all we can say is, we might have some ideas about why that might be happening, but we don't know, and it's, it might be just that in these situations, there's more information available to inform decision making based on the practice of undertaking what's referred to as gastroreception, so focusing on the lower abdomen and the structures inside the lower abdomen, that then slows down responding, so you don't have this kind of hyperreactivity. And that's actually there was a paper that came out actually last year, at the end of last year, and Hugo Critchley is on the author list. He's the last author, so he would be the head of the lab there. And they found something very similar with a go no go task, I think. Yeah, that was it. And where there was a slowing response, and so that was kind of timely, really, to have that kind of stuff coming through at the same time. And they were people who had increased their interoceptive ability over a set time period, rather like ours.
So with that, and going back to your sort of experience of Buddhism and meditative practice, does that then, it kind of fits with that then, does it, in a way? So you can be be more aware of what's going on inside your body, but less, it's less of a, maybe a knee-jerk or a conditioned reaction. You have this gap to reflect before you act. But then that's not exactly what you were testing, what was it? But it's
no, it's not what I was testing, but I mean, that's hence the surprise, really. And I think essentially what that's saying is that this kind of analogy with pain didn't hold in that sense, other than, you know, they may well be localized experiences, and it's sort of the implication was that the fact that there were these differences between the groups and they were looking at different locations implies a localized effect. But it didn't seem to track over to this notion that emotion is pain-like in exactly the same kind of way. You know, other than the fact that it wasn't painful, it didn't sort of have display some of the same kind of functions that pain does. So in terms of location, it was consistent with the Buddhist practice, where the lower abdominal area, for whatever reason and for whatever foundation, it does appear to be the location where these reactions are happening, as opposed to the heart, which is the reason we chose the heart, was because it's so well researched in interoception. It is the dominant location in the body. It's the part of the body that tends to be measured more than any other part when doing interoceptive research. So it kind of made sense to compare that with the lower abdomen, which is very under researched, really, in that research domain.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the gut area. What did you find anything different in the heart area then? What was
versus the control group?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there was certainly a slowing, but not sort of statistically significantly slower than the control group. So in terms of where the heart group sat, it was different from the lower abdomen group, not different from the control group. So there were no. There were signs of improvement in emotion regulation, though, in both groups.
Okay.
So it's, you know, which you kind of would expect, really, in terms of they're both doing interoceptive practices. They're both doing the kind of practices that have previously been shown to lead to increases in emotional engagement and improvements in regulation. But again, the lower abdomen group outstripped the heart group again. I mean, in retrospect, as I used a self-report tool called the Difficulties in Emotion Regulation Scale, and in retrospect, I wouldn't use that again, mainly because my sample were healthy, and it seems that tool is much more useful when you're looking at people who are already having difficulties, and so it's difficult to measure changes over time where they're not having difficulties, so they're having less difficulties in emotion regulation over time. So we did find differences between the two groups combined versus the control group on that measure. But when it came to the reactivity aspect, so this is something that people like Matthew Nock have. I don't know if you know him. He's I think he's in Harvard. He does lots of research on suicide, and so the notion of reactivity is sort of embedded in that kind of research. And some people see emotional reactivity as a kind of precursor to difficulties in emotion regulation. So it's like if you get that wrong, you may get problems later on with the ability to regulate emotion. So I found that the lower abdomen group improved in reactivity, had a lower reactivity over that time period relative to both the chest focus group and the control group.
So the lower abdomen group improved in their emotional regulation according to your self-reporting.
Yeah. Well, reactivity and more broadly emotion regulation. So so we're looking at sort of small changes here, which in some ways you would expect with a healthy sample, but nevertheless we did see some changes over just an 8-week period, which is the standard period.
It's short, really, in terms of, you know, when you were talking about how many years it takes for meditation practice to create some big leaps and bounds, then 8 weeks is, and in terms of neuroplasticity and turnover of tissues and cells and brain development, 8 weeks isn't very long in the grand scheme of things, but I agree it is a standard length of time.
Yeah, I mean, we did look at having a shorter intervention period, but just the evidence base just did not support that. You know, there are some that offer really very brief interventions that, you know, may last 10 minutes sometimes. And I guess these are the kind of things where you're looking at a busy psychologist, you know, and they have someone coming in and they can offer something right there and then to somebody that they can actually administer themselves. But they're just the results were so patchy that, you know, it wouldn't have been worth running a randomized controlled trial just to find that the intervention didn't work. So you come across the work of Olga Politos at all. She's based in the Ulm University in Germany. She does lots of, I mean, all our research is on interception. So we based the study partly on a previous study by her and her team, where they had found a change within an 8-week period. So it seemed that, you know, 8 weeks probably was the way to go. Yeah, just to be safe. If not, if we'd had more kind of time, we would have probably gone longer. And, you know, if we had infinite supply of money, we would have gone on for months doing that. And,
where are you taking your research next?
Well, I'm actually about to start clinical training. So that was actually partly hastened by COVID, because although New Zealand has been relatively unscathed so far by COVID, probably aware of that in the press in the UK.
You've done really well.
They've done very well, but I mean, inevitably the economy is taking a hit, and universities are cutting down right now. So I'm at this point where I'm transitioning into what should be a postdoc, but they're not taking anybody on. So I think in the kind of research that I want to do longer term, which is more of this, and I do have plans about what I'm going to do, but it makes sense to, you know, try to bridge the gap where, you know, the universities might sort of get back on their feet over time. But at the end of that, you know, having done clinical psychology training, I can then be a clinician and I can do research that's clinical research without having to always have clinicians involved, because I would be that clinician. So that's the kind of plan at the moment. Towards the end of the thesis, I was starting to sort of think a bit more broadly about the implications of some of these findings and why the gut. You know, like, I mean, it's, you know, even from the kind of Buddhist background, it still doesn't really. I don't have the answers for that. Like, why the gut? You know, all I know is that there is that experience. Other people have had that experience, and that, you know, the obvious thing to think about is the stuff on the gut biome, which is again sort of another area of research where, you know, there's sort of it's early indications that the gut has special significance for mental health specifically, not so much at this point about emotion regulation, but to my mind, the two are always going to be connected to some degree. Even as, you know, thinking about the reduced ability to regulate emotion at a very early stage that may later on down the line end up with a diagnosis potentially. You know, and so I was thinking about that and what probiotics are doing for people, and so I was thinking about running a study looking at probiotics and the effect of probiotics, and actually thinking about, is it possible to buck the trend, and as opposed to start engaging in what, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, psychobiotics, where sort of using probiotics as another ingest intervention, which of course we've had that. We've had that for quite a while now in psychiatry. Do we want another one that happens to be a probiotic, or could we actually engage in some kind of self-regulation? And so I was just sort of thinking, could I float the idea of, you know, if we're looking at the gut, if we're looking at gastroreception, could gastroreception be a practice that people could use to self-regulate their own dietary intake? You know, and so just thinking about what the evidence is saying about probiotics and the gut biome is that, you know, there's this early stage mild inflammation that occurs when certain gut bacteria, which are anti-inflammatory, become absent in the gut, and the gut then becomes permeable, and you have this so-called leaky gut syndrome and so on. Is it possible with training to detect that mild inflammation, you know, in the same kind of way in which, you know, presumably we're processing stuff in our bodies all the time that lead us to make certain decisions about what we feel hungry for. And if you're not mindful in your eating and you're not mindful in the decisions that you make about food, you might make the wrong kind of choices and you're giving your body things that it doesn't really want, but you're not getting the feedback from your body saying this is actually not what we want. We want vitamin C, we don't want vitamin D, or whatever it happens to be. So yeah, I was thinking about running a study looking at the potential for that, which might be hard to get that funded because, of course, I'm not looking necessarily to sort of support the idea that we should be engaging in psychobiotics, but it seems to be worthwhile. And I think because I think I'm very much, given my background, really interested in people developing the skills to direct themselves, not always dependent on either a clinician, which you give them the skills to actually do something in their own life, and certainly not on a compound that you ingest every day.
Absolutely. I was just speaking to one of the guys who created a course. It's called Prescribing Lifestyle Medicine, and the course it's aimed at GPs to within their 10-minute slot with a patient to be able to give some lifestyle interventions. The way that Michael put it, he said it's a gift you give back to the patient. Actually, the patient comes to the GP or whoever it is, the therapist, the clinician, looking for guidance or looking for, these days it's medication or a scan or whatever. But actually, what he thinks is you want to give that gift back to them and say, actually, you've come to me for guidance, but I'm going to give you something that you can do for yourself and give the power back to you. So yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying, that doesn't happen very much these days, but it is such a wonderful thing to be able to do.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to some degree, people do want to have something just given to them, right? They want to solve the problem and then move on. And but I think in terms of my experience and going back to Dr. Clive Sherlock, who is my sort of mentor, and he found that what he's delivering is a lifelong sort of intervention. It's like it's just a different way of engaging with life, and people sometimes get like, oh, actually, do I want that? I was thinking to come here for 8 weeks and I'll be fine after that. But actually, it doesn't ever end. It's a bit like saying, okay, I want to get healthy. How do I do that? Do I just do it for 8 weeks and then I can go and eat cakes again? No, you have to be healthy your whole life, or a diet. I have to eat the Mediterranean diet my whole life, and that's kind of not what mental health is. The provision of mental health treatment has been set up to make people believe. It's
no, I agree.
So
one thing I was just thinking about with that future direction with the gut and maybe detecting inflammation earlier. I don't know if you've seen any of the studies on interceptive exposure therapy for IBS. That was quite interesting. I thought that some of those it's a combination of education about what IBS is and how the gut works with some interceptive exposure. So I think, I don't know I can't remember what they were, whether it was deliberate drinking lots of water to make them feel bloated or wearing tight clothing or whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm very familiar with that, and that was so one of my supervisors is a clinician, and so he uses interceptive exposure. So IE has been used in CBT or part of CBT for decades, and it is part and parcel of if somebody has a sort of phobia, really. I mean, the kind of the condition that it's most known for, I think, is our anxiety disorders. So and panic attacks, and so people will be worried about what's happening in their bodies, and so then you recreate that and create that sense of anxiety and expose it in a graduated way. So yeah, it's not unknown. There are already strands of research and practice that are already implying the value of interoception. But it had limited sort of value for me in terms of, because it's quite artificial the way in which they create those experiences. Like you say, they have sort of actually with more respiratory, really. It's like respiratory restrictions where you have a CO2 restriction, or you have a band that around the chest that prevents them from breathing, and that gives them a sense of being breathless. And so,
but maybe they know it's not exactly the same as their usual trigger. So it doesn't. Is that what you're saying? It's artificial in that it's it's not the same as the normal core?
Well, it's just something I couldn't really use. I couldn't really use it myself because I was looking for sort of natural emotional responses in certain locations. But
right, okay.
But no, yeah, it's definitely out there. There's a lot of research on that.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for your time. I did that. I sent over some draft questions. There was a couple of others. One of the things I'm really wanting to get a handle on is how different people talk about this phenomena day to day. So you're a good person to ask because you've studied it from an academic point of view, plus from your Buddhist background. So how do you, if you were to meet someone on the street who you don't think has got any kind of knowledge of what interoception is, how do you begin that conversation?
Yeah, good question. I obviously read your questions. So I tend to just give the party line, as it were, and say that it's the sense of the physiological condition of the body, which of course is Bud Craig's famous statement of what interoception is. Beyond that, I mean, in terms of the way I spoke to my participants, who I have to say were medical students and doctors and nurses, so they weren't exactly lay people, I would say, and some of them may well have come across interoception, or they would have done at some point in their training. And yeah, I would just say that it's I was very interested in specifically visceral reception, so I say it would be sensing the heart, sensing the activity of the heart, sensing the changes in the gut, sensing changes in breathing, that kind of thing, just to keep it very simple. And during the intervention, of course, that's when I really had to be very careful about what I said about what interoception is, not just so that they, to avoid confusion, but also so I didn't add in extra variables that I actually wasn't measuring. So like I was very tempted to start talking about, when you engage in this practice, you should not judge and you should be accepting and that kind of thing. But of course, once you start doing that, then you've got a whole other kind of set of measures that you have to start thinking about. Is it to do with acceptance, or is it to do with like the non-judgment, or is it to do with the focus, and what is it? So all I told people was just to focus on the inside of whichever area they'd been allocated. So whether it's inside the chest or inside to the structures and organs that are there. And then, because typically, I think this is the part that I wanted to say to you about this, that particularly in Western countries, we're fixated on thinking, we're fixated on concepts and imagination and trying to articulate things mentally, as opposed to experiencing things directly. So I gave two examples to the participants, just to make clear what interoception isn't. So it wasn't just about saying what it is, because then that leaves open all these kind of different interpretations they might have about what it is. And that was threading a needle was one example, and the other one was tasting food, right? So I was saying that interoception is not about thinking. It's not about imagining your heart. It's not about imagining, I didn't mention heart, but it's not about imagining the structures inside the body. What happens when you are threading a needle? Like, are you thinking about threading a needle? Actually, if you start thinking about threading a needle, you're not going to be very good at threading that needle. You have to give your whole attention to that needle and the filament at the end of that piece of thread, which is often bent round. So it's very difficult to get it through the eye of that needle. And then you realize that actually you really have to go right into that process, which is very Buddhist in that way, and very mindfulness kind of practice.
Yeah.
To be able to successfully thread that needle. Right? So that's one part. Another part was thinking about tasting food. Do you think about the taste of the food when you're tasting the food? Do you think, this tastes sweet, that kind of thing? Is the experience of tasting food, does that consist in the thinking about the experience? Well, it doesn't. You have to go beyond that into the actual experience itself. Then I was saying, okay, so take these two examples. That's what the interoception process is demanding of you, that you go right into that experience, to taste that experience at its root. And even though I did that 4 weeks in, so a halfway point, I'd have a short conversation with all the participants. I'd say, what do you think the intervention is? What do you think you're supposed to be doing? I think I'm thinking about my heart, or I'm thinking about my body or something. I'd like, no, it's not thinking. So even with that, they fall back into that typical thinking process. And to my mind, so again, sorry?
There was still using thinking rather than actual sensing or feeling.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And there's nothing in interoception research to say that there's anything to do with concepts or thinking. That actually you really have to have the sensations themselves. Otherwise, you never get to the point where you're getting the emotional feedback. You're still just engaging in cognition the whole time. So I think, you know, if people are wanting to engage in interventions that can work over relatively short time scales, that's going to be a real challenge for people, is to overcome that tendency to think and conceptualize.
There's no real way, because I mean, I'm not familiar with all the I know there's the heartbeat, the accuracy, heartbeat detection accuracy. So that's for people to show improvements on that would suggest they genuinely are feeling their heartbeat. But apart from that, the questionnaires are still, a lot of them could be thought processes, couldn't they, rather than feelings, I suppose.
Well, they typically measure traits. So yeah, so you're talking about a general tendency to do X. I mean, in terms of, I mean, the task you just mentioned, which was, I guess, the Chandri task, you know, where you're sort of getting that ability to be accurate in terms of your measurement of detection of heartbeat. I mean, that's run into problems as well. I mean, in terms of how efficacious that really is in terms of measurement, and so that, I mean, in general, that this area is plagued by difficulties for objective measurement. I mean, there is EGG, electrogastrograms, for measurement of gut activity. So there is that analog. But there's also a heartbeat. It's like they have a beep, and then you have to see if there's a correspondence with your heartbeat. And then you can actually match up the two. So that's apparently more valid for at least the heart anyway. If the Chandri task really is on its last legs, which some people think it is. And I actually found problems with that during my study. I think partly because I had medical students who probably had some sense of what a heart rate is like from moment to moment.
Yeah.
So they were engaging in the kind of top-down stuff that I was trying to avoid, and I've just been talking to you about. So yeah, it's a fascinating area of research, but it has a long way to go, and it's still evolving. There's still people writing now. I think it might be the Garfinkel group who are sort of looking at articulating interoception in different ways now, thinking about separating it out attention specifically. So yeah, we'll see where it goes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm aware it's coming up to an hour. Is there anything else you want to say or talk about or communicate?
I think it would just be good if you probably would benefit from having a quick word with Clive, who, you know, he's been around a lot longer than I have. He's not doing interoception. He wouldn't call it interoception, but I mean, he's had patients for, as I say, 40 to 50 years, and may be able to give a fuller account of how to talk to people about this. Although, as I say, he's not using interoception specifically or talking about interoception, he's essentially doing the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he is all about keeping things simple, and so it might be worth having a chat with him. Okay.
No,
have a good night.
Thank you. You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.